On today's show, the Hawks make a couple of roster moves on this Friday. We'll touch on all of what transpired, what to think of the roster moving forward, and more on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 152 of Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Friday here in late July. Today's show is brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook on the Locked On Podcast Network. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn right now to get started. I also want to tell you at the top of the podcast that I appreciate you joining us and making us your first listen each and every day. Please check us out and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts, places like Apple, Spotify, YouTube, etc. And I'll say this right now at the top of the podcast, I am playing a little bit hurt right now. In fact, I have had COVID the last several days, so hopefully the latter stages of COVID, and my apologies for the lack of podcast content over the last 3 or 4 days, but I'm trying to fight through a short one here on the Friday because of the transactions that took place on Friday from the Hawks. So broadly speaking, we'll talk about Wes Matthews at the top of the podcast and Tyrese Martin after that, and then sort of a reset on where the Hawks are roster-wise as we head into late July and then into August. All right, first we'll start with Wes Matthews, a familiar name if you are a diehard NBA fan by any description, really, and also the first free agent signing of the entire cycle for the Hawks. Of course, the Hawks have made some trades already this cycle, sending John Collins out, etc. Lots of trades and action and draft picks, all that stuff. But the first free agent signing from outside the organization, it comes about 3 weeks after the free agent frenzy actually began, and really it's almost over at this point. Woj reported this first on Friday morning. I was able to confirm it right after that Matthews is going to be coming to the Hawks. I have not heard definitively on the terms of the deal, but the widespread assumption, including for me, is that a 1-year veteran minimum contract. If that is the case, and again, I'm not 100% sure of that. Matthews has been in the league for more than 10 years. He's actually making more than the usual minimum. His minimum actually is about $3.1-ish million. The Hawks will only have to pay about $2 million of that because the vet minimum, I'm going to go down this rabbit hole too much. If you're past that certain point, the league pays the rest of your salary. So the Hawks will pay the vet minimum. Matthews would actually make about $3 million in there. And the Hawks are so far below the tax right now, it doesn't really particularly matter, especially because they also moved on from Martin today. But anyway, beyond the contractual stuff, Matthews is actually 36 years old, one of the older players still in the league. I'll be 37 years old in October, been in the league for 14 seasons with 7 different teams. And I would basically describe him, if you don't know his game, as a very reliable veteran wing in the 3-and-D mold. He spent the last 2 years with Milwaukee, basically kind of a spot shooter on offense at this point in time. He's taken more than 70% of his shots from three-point range in the last 4 seasons consecutively. So he's definitely mostly a specialist on offense, not really going to be doing much of anything inside the arc. And as a result, his field goal percentages have been pretty rough the last few years because he's really just taking threes. Not quite on the Garrison Matthews, like only takes threes scale, but mostly what he's going to give you 70-75% of the time of his shots. It's basically layups and threes from Wes Matthews. Not a great shooter at this point, but a career like 37-38% guy. Not quite been that the last couple of years as it gets older, but certainly he'll take threes, which I think is a lot of the value comes with that with Matthews. 7 or 8 per 100 possessions. He has to be guarded. He is a threat out there. You can't just leave him alone, which I think is the big appeal of Matthews on offense. And then on defense, he's very, very solid. He's not an elite athlete at this point at the age of 36 into 37, but he's very solid, very strong. He's defended some of the best wings in the league in his career, even with Milwaukee in the playoffs a couple of years ago. He was taking the number 1 assignment a lot of the time. He's lost quickness over the years for sure, as you'd expect for a guy at his age, but he's definitely a solid one-on-one defender on the wing, a good team defender in a lot of ways. He'll execute, do what he's supposed to do on defense. So broadly speaking, I've had a lot of people ask questions. I won't answer like a ton of mailbag individual questions, but there's 1 or 2 on this podcast I want to at least touch on. One of them is that a lot of people have asked if this like kind of means anything with regard to a trade being imminent, or what this, people are suggesting this definitely means they're going to trade for Pascal Siakam. I would definitely say it does not mean any of that. It certainly could help in some respects for depth purposes, but number one, you can't have too many wings. I firmly believe that Matthews is a good veteran to have, even if he's not going to play every night. And by the way, if they're 100% healthy, I would guess he probably doesn't play on opening night, but he can defend and take threes, doesn't need the ball, fits well, and is a great locker room guy. That's a good player to add on a veteran minimum contract. The comparison I would make in some ways, different players in a lot of ways, but is to Aaron Holiday last year, where I praised that signing. I think it worked out very well. And yeah, Aaron's not a great player, but it was a veteran minimum contract for a guy that wasn't going to play every night, and he didn't play every night, but was able to step in and be competent when he played. Wes Matthews is actually better than Aaron Holiday in my mind, as long as he doesn't fall off a cliff, but a different kind of player archetype. But that's kind of the theory behind this. Again, this is a veteran minimum contract. You're not investing a lot in this player. Number two on this, besides the number one thing being you can't have too many wings, number two is the Hawks don't have some kind of crazy roster situation where they have to bring in different guys and overhaul things because they're signing Wes Matthews. They have to make at least one more transaction between now and October because they have 16 guys under contract. Only 15 of those are not a guarantee, which is definitely important to note. That does not mean, though, that a trade is coming. They could roll this in a training camp. That wouldn't be a surprise to me at all. And number three, like, not everything has to do with Pascal Siakam in the world. I had a lot of people asking like this was definitely having something to do with that. And people I know are just focused on that every single time anything that comes up right now. And I get it. But, same thing with cutting Tyrese Martin, which we'll talk about in a second. These moves can just be operating independent of that in some ways. It does not have to be related all the way across. So again, overall, I would describe this as a very, very good signing for the veteran minimum. I know fans wanted to see a bigger splash with free agency, especially with the potentially the only free agent signing the Hawks make this offseason. But when you wait this long, the market is exceptionally barren right now. There's a couple of guys who I think are worth more than minimum that are still out there. PJ Washington is probably the best player available, but he's a restricted free agent, so the Hawks are not really going to get into that mix. Like Kelly Oubre is available. Christian Wood doesn't really fit the Hawks at all, but he's available. Some bigger names, but I think beyond that, there really wasn't much. And Matthews would have been certainly in my top 10 available players for the Hawks, especially with having to do with the minimum. So he can play for you if you need him to. He doesn't have to play for you every night, which is probably very helpful. It's a good guy to have depth-wise. If you get an injury or two to your wing players, he's someone you can functionally and reliably use 20 minutes a game if you have to, in a way that you cannot necessarily rely on guys like Martin, who we'll talk about in a second, Beat Krejci or Seth Lundy or Mohamed Gay. Like if you have a choice between on a team that's trying to win right now, playing 15 minutes a night with Wes Matthews versus Seth Lundy or Mohamed Gay or Beat Krejci, you're going to choose Wes Matthews. He's a much better, sort of more reliable option right now today. Long term, obviously not, but I think it's probably good to have some more depth, in particular when it comes to shooting and defense on the wing, where the Hawks are not exactly flush with talent. At least in terms of depth. Now, yes, there is a scenario where the Hawks still make the Pascal Siakam trade. That is definitely possible. I'm not saying it's not, because it definitely is. Talked about that a lot on the podcast in the last couple of weeks. But I do think that if that were to happen, yeah, it'd be great to have Wes Matthews around for some more depth in the wing, because you're trading a lot of your depth if you happen to do that with DeAndre Hunter, et cetera. But for now, just bringing in Matthews makes a lot of sense independently of Tyrese Martin, independently of anything else. Just adding another guy who's a veteran, knows how to play. The Hawks don't really have a lot of old heads, and now they have two with Patty Mills and Wes Matthews. They don't have a lot of 30-plus-year-old guys, and Wes being a true veteran, like one of the only guys in the league that's actually older, I guess my age or so in the league still. And we'll leave it there for now. We'll have more on Tyrese Martin in a second, as well as kind of where the Hawks roster is with regard to the rest of the offseason. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Baseball season is in full swing. Take your first swing at betting MLB at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're a new customer, get up to 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right, bet $20. You get $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. FanDuel has great promotions each and every day. You get paid instantly when you win. The app is also safe and secure, and they have all kinds of betting angles for you. They cover the whole range of sports. That includes MLB, NBA, WNBA, NFL, college football, college basketball, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, and more. And different wagering options as well: live betting, futures, player props, point spreads, totals, money lines, etc. There's no better place to find all the baseball and basketball action than America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up right now. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on. Get up to $200 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com/locked-on. One more time, FanDuel.com/locked-on. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, the second transaction actually happened pretty much alongside the first transaction on Friday, and that's the Hawks moving on from Tyrese Martin. For some background here, Martin was drafted in the second round last year by the Hawks, 2022, made a rookie minimum last year. I said this a few different times, but it's definitely the case where the Hawks actually, a lot of teams would have had Tyrese on a two-way, but because the Hawks were trying to duck the tax as actively as they were, no matter what they say, last year, it actually benefited them to actually have him on a full contract. So he actually made more money than he probably would have normally made last year on the rookie minimum, about $1 million. But the sort of the trade-off from that was that he was on a non-guaranteed contract for year 2 at about $1.7 million. That's about the minimum or so. But today was the guarantee date, July 21st for Martin. And it was basically the decision day for the Hawks. For me, this is not a surprising decision. Martin has some strong traits as a player. When I talked to Wesley Matthews earlier this week, actually on the podcast, we kind of agreed on this. He's kind of stuck between the G League and the NBA. He's kind of that quad A player, is the way that you would describe it in baseball terms. I still feel that way in a lot of ways. It's not to be mean to Tyrese, but he doesn't really have the clear elite skill to push him over the top as far as being an NBA player. He's a very limited athlete in some respects. He's not a great shooter. He's a tough guy. He's not a terrible athlete by any means. Not a non-shooter either, but isn't great at that stuff. Plus, he's not like good enough at anything else. He's not an elite defender. He's definitely physical, but not a great defender, not a great passer, etc. He's kind of just okay at everything without being great at anything. And also, it's not all about age, but he's a second-year player, yes, but he's actually 24 already. He'll be 25 later this year during the season. So not the same growth projection as some guys that you might expect in year 2. So for me, it's not a surprising decision. It's one that I agree with, honestly, in that I don't think that Mart was going to be a guy that's going to make you pay too much for this. Maybe I'll be wrong about that. I certainly will root for the guy. I like Tyrese. I have talked to him several times, but I think this is probably the right decision. Him versus Vit Krejci became a talking point in the last couple of days, or I guess weeks, for Hawks fans. I think neither one of those guys is like fantastic prospects. I would probably lean slightly to Vit, just for the fact that he has a little bit more size, a little bit more passing. But Tyrese is a better defender, so there's definitely pros and cons there. Vit also had the later on guarantee date, which I talked about with Wes. I think at the end of the day, it was much more valuable for the Hawks to kind of have Vit's guarantee date be in January versus Tyrese's in July, and that's kind of maybe part of why they did this. I had a question from somebody who asked me actually if the Hawks could sign him, Tyrese Martin, to a two-way contract because they had that extra spot open. The answer is technically yes, if he were to clear waivers. So the Hawks, as of right now, as I record this podcast, have not quite officially announced the waiver of Martin, which they had until the end of the day to do. If he were to clear waivers, the Hawks could, in theory, sign him to a two-way because he's still eligible to sign a two-way. I'm not sure how realistic that is or whether the Hawks want to do that or not, but they could. To answer the question, they absolutely could do that. They had that spot open, and he's eligible for it. I got a question from someone named Manic Monkey on Twitter, which kind of talks about all the stuff that happened today. So I'll just lay it out there. Why did the team, this is the question, why did the team decide to release Tyrese Martin and then pick up Wesley Matthews, an older player who does not perform well? I think the question kind of hits on all the boxes that we talked about on the podcast, but I think they're related in some respects, but also not necessarily related in every respect. Moving on from Martin, I think had to happen one way or the other. It's independent in some ways because, again, it's basically a decision that the team is making to answer this part of the question, that they'd rather have the flexibility and the roster spot and not have it be going to Tyrese Martin for guaranteed money. I don't think they're kind of banking on him not being worth that contract right now. And again, I tend to agree. He's already 24. He's not really ready to play in the NBA right now. Plus, it wasn't signed beyond this season. He wasn't on one of those super team-friendly 4-year deals like Mohamed Gay signed. So I personally would have probably done this if I was the Hawks as well. As for Matthews, it's not sexy, but again, like I said before, describing him as a player who does not perform well, like the questions is not something I agree with. I think he's not a great player or anything like that, but Matthews is much, much more likely to play and contribute in an NBA game in 2023 than someone like Martin or someone like Krejci or someone like Mohamed Gay or Seth Lundy or Miles Norris or any of those guys. Obviously, that's a low bar to clear, but for the Hawks trying to win now, he could be very useful. Again, also, he's a 14-year veteran who is very well respected, around the league. In fact, he can defend, take some threes, etc. Pretty easy decision there. I know the moves happened on the same day, but I wouldn't necessarily just view it as a swap for these guys because they had to choose on Martin either way. And I think from what I'd heard, it was more likely than not they were going to cut Tyrese either way. So there's something on that. Plus, the Hawks still do have a roster question, not a huge crunch, but they have a roster decision to make in the next couple of weeks and months. Because Vit Krejci is on a non-guaranteed contract, which is non-guaranteed until January, but somebody has to be waived or traded between now and the season starting because you can't carry 16 guys. You can into training camp, but once you get to the season, you have to cut down to 15 guaranteed contracts plus two-ways. So one more thing before we get out of here, and my apologies again for my voice, as a roster reset. So the Hawks have 15 guys on guaranteed contracts. I'll just name them for you. At guard, they have Trey, DeJounte, Patty Mills, and Kobe Buffkin. On the wings, you have Bogdanovich, you have Griffin, you have Garrison Matthews, and Wes Matthews, the two Matthews. Then at the forwards, you have Hunter, Jalen Johnson, Sadiq Bey, and then Mohamed Gay. And at center, you have Capella, Okongwu, and Bruno Fernando. So then you have Vit on the non-guaranteed deal. Again, if they don't do anything else, the most natural move the Hawks can make between now and opening night is to cut Krejci. I'm not saying they're going to do that or that they have to do that, but that would be the least consequential decision they can make because he's not guaranteed. Otherwise, they have to trade someone or cut someone that has guaranteed money, whether it be Patty Mills or whatever, or a trade. Obviously, a trade could certainly happen between now and then. Then, of course, you have the two ways. You have Seth Lundy and Miles Norris. They have a two-way qualifying offer out to Trent Forrest. We'll see if he signs that or if he comes back on that deal, or they have that third spot open if they want to use it. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, this is a roster that could, I want to say stress, could just roll into the season like this with just one minor move. If all they wanted to do was cut Krejci and roll with this, they definitely could. So we'll see if that happens. Trade stuff could happen. The Siakam talk is still out there. I'll talk about this probably a little bit, probably next week. But there was some reporting from Mark Stein and Chris Haynes on their podcast today about Siakam and how it's still kind of been talked about, et cetera. So we'll get into all that later on. But for now, Siakam is in the ether as a talking point. But today was about these two transactions, Wes Matthews in, Tyrese Martin out. And I think in general, I agree with both decisions. I think if you were available to sign Wes Matthews to a better minimum contract, I would have done it. That's a good move in my opinion. And then, again, I don't mean it to be a negative, but I would have probably moved on from Tyrese if I had that choice as well. So there you go. Hopefully this was a coherent podcast as my brain is fried at this point in time. But thanks for listening to the podcast, everybody, for your patience this week as well. I will be hopefully back to more close to 100% for next week. We'll have still podcasts on a regular basis. Not going to be every single day as the offseason gets into his real dead period between basically now and like mid-September. We'll probably be down to 2 or 3 a week on this feed, but I'll have content coming to you. So please subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, places like Apple, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Please follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland. Thank you, everybody. I really do appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and your weekend, and we'll see you next time.